You know, there's this quote that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. It says, most investment advice is built on hope. We don't do hope. We do math. And that's the thing. So much of what passes for financial planning is really just crossing your fingers. In this explainer, we're going to flip that script. We're going to treat financial independence like an engineering problem that can be solved.
So you've got two ways of looking at it. On one side, there's what you might call the hope approach. You know the drill. Retire around 65, hope the market gives you 10% a year, and, well, hope you don't run out of cash. But then there's the engineer's approach. This is totally different. It's about defining the problem. What are your inputs, like how much you save? What are your constraints, like time and taxes? And, this is the big one, what are the possible failure modes? How can this whole thing break? And how do we design a system that won't?
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to establish why hope just isn't a strategy. Then we'll get into the real rules of the game. After that, we'll talk about building your fortune, then living off of it, and finally, maybe the most important part, how to play active defense to make sure you keep it.
All right, first up, the rules of the game. See, before you can even think about winning, you have to understand the field you're playing on. And that means you absolutely have to understand the single most dangerous risk you're going to face. And that risk has a name. It's called sequence of returns risk. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It means that the order in which you get your investment returns matters way more than the average return itself. Getting a huge market crash right after you retire can be an absolute disaster. In a way, it just isn't when you're 35 and still saving. It's all about the timing.
To really make this sink in, let's use a quick example. Let's meet Alice and Bob. They both retire with a cool $1 million. They both need to pull out the same amount of money to live on. And get this, over 2 years, they get the exact same average return on their investments. So, how is it possible that one of them ends up with way less money than the other?
Well, let's follow the money. Alice has terrible luck. In her very first year, the market crashes and she loses 50%. Her $1 million is suddenly just 500 grand. On top of that, she has to withdraw $100,000 to live. Now she's down to just 400K. Bob, on the other hand, gets a fantastic boom in his first year. His $1 million doubles to $2 million before he takes out his 100K.
So after year 2, the market bounces back for Alice, but the damage is already done. She ends up with only $700,000. That early loss, combined with having to sell her stocks when they were down, just blew a hole in her portfolio that she couldn't recover from. And Bob? Well, Bob ends up with $850,000. Yeah, he had the exact same crash as Alice in his second year, but because it came after a year of huge growth, his portfolio was big enough to take the hit without it being a fatal blow.
And just like that, there's a $150,000 gap between them, a gap that will likely never close. It's a permanent penalty for Alice created only because of the bad timing of the market. That, right there, is the devastating power of sequence risk.
Okay, so we understand the biggest danger. Now, let's switch gears and talk about building the fortune in the first place. This is the accumulation phase, your working years, and this is where you have the most power.
One of the biggest levers you can pull is simply time. It's huge. Look at this. To get to $2.5 million by age 65, if you start at 25, you need to save about $1,000 a month. Not easy, but maybe doable. But what if you wait until you're 45 to get serious? Well, now you have to come up with almost $5,000 every single month. That's the magic of compound interest, but you have to give it time to work.
Let's look at it another way. How much of your own money do you have to put in? The 25-year-old only has to contribute less than $500,000 out of their own pocket to hit the goal. The 45-year-old, they have to cough up over $1.1 million of their own cash. Why? Because they missed out on 20 years where the market could have been doing all the heavy lifting for them.
Now, the other giant lever you have complete control over is fees. A 1% advisor fee. I mean, it sounds so small, doesn't it? But here's the catch. They don't take 1% of your profits. They take 1% of your entire account balance, year after year, whether you make money or lose it. Over 30 years, that tiny little drag becomes a massive anchor.
And the final number is just, it's staggering. That small 1% fee doesn't just cost you the fees you paid. It ends up costing you almost $1.9 million in lost growth. That's money that should have been yours, gone forever. Honestly, learning to manage a simple portfolio of index funds yourself could be the highest paying job you ever have.
All right, let's make another big shift.
You did it. You built your fortune. Now, you have to live off of it. And believe me, the game completely changes when you go from putting money in to taking money out.
You've probably heard of the 4% rule. It's a fine starting point, but it's way too robotic. It says you'll spend the same amount plus inflation even if the market gets cut in half. I mean, come on, what human actually does that? A much smarter way is to use a variable strategy. The deal you make with yourself is simple. If the markets take a nosedive, you agree to cut back your spending a little bit. And in exchange for that little bit of flexibility, you can often start with a much higher withdrawal rate, sometimes even over 5%. Now this brings us to a really funny paradox in retirement planning. Because we build these plans to survive the absolute worst-case scenario in history, they are incredibly conservative. So what's the result? Well, the most likely outcome for most people isn't actually running out of money. That's incredibly rare. No, the most common outcome is dying with way, way more money than you ever thought possible.
So while most plans are built to avoid failure, what happens when the very ground beneath them cracks? This leads us to our final and maybe most critical section, playing active defense. We've all heard the mantra buy and hold. It's great advice and it works beautifully right up until the moment it doesn't.
A lot of us just assume that markets always come back, and they come back pretty quickly. But we need to look at the cautionary tale of Japan. Their stock market hit its all-time high in 1989. 20 years later, it was still down 80%. It took 34 years, literally an entire career, just to get back to even. Think about that. A buy-and-hold retiree in 1989 Japan went broke, period.
And the lesson here is just unavoidable. If your foundational strategy, buy and hold, can fail for literally decades at a time, you can't rely on it alone. You just can't. You have to have a defensive plan for those worst-case scenarios.
So what does a defensive plan even look like? Well, here are a couple of ideas. One is called trend following. Think of it like a traffic light. When the long-term market trend is green and going up, you're invested. But when that trend turns red and starts to fall, a rule you set up ahead of time automatically moves you to the safety of cash to avoid the big crash. Another approach is to use put options, which is basically just buying insurance for your portfolio. Like car insurance, you pay a small premium every year. If the market crashes below a certain level, the insurance policy kicks in and pays you, putting a floor on how much you can lose.
So, at the end of the day, the engineer's approach to all this comes down to a few key ideas. First, treat your financial life like a system you can design and manage, not some lottery's ticket you're hoping pays off. Second, understand that sequence risk, the order of your returns, is the #1 enemy in retirement. Third, pull the two biggest levers you have. Start saving as early as you can and be absolutely ruthless about minimizing fees. Fourth, use a flexible withdrawal plan that can adapt to reality, not a rigid robot rule. And finally, have a defensive game plan for those nightmare scenarios where buy and hold just isn't enough.
And all of that leaves us with one last question you should really ask yourself when you take a hard, honest look at your own financial plan. Is it truly engineered to withstand the pressures of the real world? Or, when you get right down to it, is it just built on hope?